Welcome back to the Political Marketing Podcast with me, Benedict Pringle. This is the podcast that seeks to understand how election candidates, political parties, and campaigning organisations win hearts, minds, and votes. It's an absolute honour to introduce my guest today. He is one of the most important academics on political advertising in the world. He is none other than Travis Ridout, the distinguished professor and director of the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at Washington State University. He's also the co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project. This organization tracks and analyzes all broadcast advertisements aired or by or on behalf of federal and state election candidates in every medium. And his research on political advertising has been published in all of the most prestigious political science journals. His book, Political Advertising in the United States, which is a collaboration with some other authors, is an essential read for anyone who's interested in the field of political advertising. It's a brilliant primer, and yet I find myself referring back to it all the time. So it really is a book that is worth reading if you're interested in this stuff. Travis is also a former Fulbright scholar and chair of the political communications section of the American Political Science Association. It's fantastic to have him here with us today. Welcome, Travis.
Well, thank you very much.
So I want to start with a question that I get asked pretty much every time I ever do anything about political advertising in the media. And it's, why are all election ads so negative? You've done a lot of research on the topic, and I'd love to dig into it with you. So firstly, on this topic of negative advertising, you have three ways of categorizing an ad. Could you tell us about those three ways?
Absolutely. So there's the positive ad or purely promotional ad. It's all about the favored candidate. There's on the other side the negative ad, which is all about the targeted candidate, sometimes called attack ads. And then there's kind of the blending of the two, which we call a contrast ad or a comparative ad, that's really both about the favored candidate and the targeted candidate. So I'm going to lower your taxes. My opponent is going to raise your taxes. That's the contrast ad.
Yeah. Very nice. That brings a whole load of ads to mind immediately, doesn't it? And citizens and journalists sort of always seem to claim that advertising has got more negative. Is that the case?
To some extent, in the U.S., we have some hard numbers on this going back to, say, the mid-1990s, and we found an increase throughout the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s. Negativity kind of plateaued around 2010 in Senate and House races, and we've seen that high level of negativity ever since. This last presidential race in the U.S., however, was indeed the most negative ever. In fact, it was, I think, fewer than 1% of Donald Trump's ads or ads favoring Trump were actually positive ads. The rest were purely negative or contrast.
Gosh, that is staggering. And it must be effective then. Why is negative advertising so effective?
Why is it effective? A few different reasons. One, it causes people to pay attention. And even though a lot of people say we don't like those negative ads, it can make them angry, which can inspire political action. Negative advertising in the right circumstances can also be demobilizing. So let's say you've already decided, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. You see a bunch of negative ads, it makes you less enthusiastic about voting for Donald Trump or voting at all. It's not going to make you say, well, I'm going to vote for Harris now. It's just going to make you say, I think I'll sit out this election.
That's fascinating. And I've read that, and maybe this is because of the emotional response that you get from negative ads, that we tend to remember them better, and also that because most people sort of can believe something negative about a politician, they're more likely to believe them. I don't know if you've ever seen any evidence of that.
Well, I mean, ads are packaged in very clever ways. They appeal to your emotions. That a politician is corrupt, yeah, that's believable. And so, and we have what, 60, 70 years of experience in designing these ads in a way to appeal to the voter. And so, in many ways, they can be effective, though we don't want to go too far in making that case.
Because, I mean, yeah, I love political advertising, and I'm sure lots of people listening feel the same. And I really don't have an aversion to negative ads, and I've sort of have this hunch that, deep down, people actually quite like them. They feel like they should say they don't like them, uh, but they do. It's like reading tabloids. The people like reading about other people's dirty laundry, and we never like to say that, but really we do. I just wondered if you have done research on, do people really not like negative ads, uh, or is it the case they've got a, they say they don't, but really they do.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, because when we ask the question differently, say, is it fair for a candidate to point out differences between themselves and an opponent? Most people say, yeah, that's perfectly legitimate. That's fair. And so maybe it's just that phrase, attack ads or negative advertising. As a good citizen, I'm not supposed to like that. But at the end of the day, I may actually find that useful. And if it's attacking the other guy, that could be fun too.
Yeah. And let's go a bit further on that, because you and I repeat this to lots of people. So you argue that negative ads can actually be more informative and more substantive than positive ads. I wonder if you could explain a little about that.
Yeah, part of that is just empirically, they're more likely to discuss issues, policy issues, than are the positive ads. The positive ads um, tend to get pretty boring. They're pretty trite. I'm I represent your values. Here's my family. I want smart kids. Okay, we've seen that all before. Whereas the negative ad, well, there's something new. It makes you pay attention. Here's a reason to vote for this candidate as opposed to the other candidate. And so I'm not saying every negative ad is more effective than every positive ad. And of course, it depends on the timing in the campaign as well. But there are definitely situations in which those negative ads work.
And I guess the logic would follow then, if it is a close contest with lots of advertising and lots of negative advertising, the electorate would be more informed than a contest where it's not close, and there's not much election, not much election advertising, and perhaps even not much negative advertising.
Yeah, and there's good political science evidence to support that. When you've seen more ads, when you've seen more negative ads, we've shown you're more likely to be able to say, okay, this candidate's on the liberal side, this candidate's on the conservative side. Our clarity about those candidates and what they stand for is higher when we've been exposed to a lot of advertising.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't know if you have followed this, but in the European Union, Google and Meta have stopped taking election ads, and I'm sort of, I think that's a real problem, because they make up a significant portion of the digital media inventory that's available to election candidates and parties. And so you're going to have this situation where potentially, I mean, hopefully, they will find a way to advertise and reach people outside of those platforms, but you could end up in a situation where the European Union ends up on a much lower information electorate, which would be a real shame.
Yeah, and we've seen something similar in my state of Washington. Due to some state regulations on transparency, Google and Meta have opted out of state elections, and I've talked to local candidates who are just saddened over this because it makes it much more difficult for them to speak to and reach out to voters.
I did not know that had happened in the US as well. Right.
It,
And
it
is it many states that have done that sort of thing?
It's a small number of states, maybe 4 or 5, but they
Right.
have transparency regulations that the major companies don't want to have to deal with. And so instead, they've just opted out of those races.
Find that shocking because, well, or just interesting because in the European Union, we kind of one of the things that we've been chatting about is, well, the money's so small, in the grand scheme of it, it doesn't make such a difference. But in the US, the money ain't small.
That is true, but Meta was sued by the state of Washington for not abiding by its transparency regulations, and lawyers are expensive as well.
Very true. Okay, so final one on negative ads before we move on. So um, you've shown that interest groups, so not the candidates, but third party groups, are more likely to run negative ads than the candidates themselves. Could you explain a little bit about why that might be?
Yeah, part of it is a concern with a voter backlash. There is some evidence that, if voters see a really negative ad, that might make them think negatively about the sponsor of that ad. So if that's the candidate, um, then that candidate is exposed to some backlash. But if it's a group with a nice name, then the group gets that backlash, which there is no real backlash because people don't vote for groups, they vote for candidates. And so it's easier for those groups to run really negative ads without consequence. The other thing we see is those group-sponsored ads tend to be more persuasive. If we see it's from a politician, we immediately discount that, right? Because politicians are self-interested. But if the message comes from a group, Americans for a Better America, well, what do they want? They want a better America, right? And they're sending me this message. And so people are more likely to believe that message, and thus it's more persuasive.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think in the UK there's less third party advertising than there is in the States. Largely because there are laws in place to try and limit it, and we'll come on to it in a bit. Why that isn't the case in the US. There's sort of the parties now adopt very different tactics to try and minimize this backlash. So in the last general election here in the UK in 2024, the Labour Party, who were the challenger, used sort of normal voters to launch the most vitriolic attacks on the government. And so by it coming out of the words of voters, the Labour Party, I think, tried to avoid getting any of the negative backlash. I thought that was quite clever. And then there's something else which I have heard said before, and I believe it to be the case, which is if you're running an attack, one of the ways in which you can minimize the backlash is by using something that the target audience already believe to be true. So you're in essence reminding them of something which they have already thought, rather than trying to seed a new idea. I wondered if you'd ever come across anything like that, and whether there was any evidence to back that sort of theory up.
No, I think that's absolutely true. It also just makes that ad more persuasive. It takes a lot of repetition of a message to make something seem true if it doesn't fit with your preconceptions of a particular politician, right? Joe Biden, isn't a serious candidate because he parties all night and loves the celebrity lifestyle. Boy, you'd have to repeat that a lot for anyone to start believing that, right? But if the attack is, he's doesn't work all that hard, he sleeps a lot, really won't be there at 2 a.m. when he's needed, well, that might resonate more. And so picking up on those preconceived ideas that people have about politicians is important. And if they don't know much about a politician, um, being out there early to get those seeds planted in voters' minds is also important.
Right. So, in fact, do you know what? We'll come back to that because I'm interested in the go early or go late debate because it happens every election cycle, and I want to sort of come back to that in a bit. So let's talk about effectiveness, because if the first question I'm ever asked is why are they all so negative, the second one is, so do these things actually work? And people, I work in commercial advertising as well. Everyone is incredibly skeptical that anyone could ever be persuaded by any piece of election. They think, oh, surely it can't be the case. This is just wallpaper. No one believes it. Doesn't do anything. What do we know about the effectiveness of election advertising?
Well, we know a few things. One is that the less people know about the candidates, the more that advertising is going to matter. And so you have this big irony in the U.S. that these multi-millions, more than $1 billion now, is spent on political ads in the presidential race, which is the race it's least likely to matter, right? The further you go down the ballot, the more likely that advertising is going to matter. So that's one thing we know. What else do we know? It depends on the ad itself. Some are just more effective than other ads, and some of them might even have negative effectiveness depending on the message, depending on how it's designed. But on average, we think ads in, say, a U.S. Senate campaign do matter, especially when one side has a greater advantage. Oftentimes, it's the case that candidates are just canceling out the other candidates' advertisements, even though they're both spending $50 million. It's kind of to a draw. But when you can find those situations when one candidate is really outspending another, I like to point to the example of Barack Obama. Spent a bunch of it on advertising in the state of Indiana in 2008. McCain barely spent in that state. And Barack Obama won this really Republican state in 2008, kind of dominated the airwaves in that state. And so in those rare instances when you find that big imbalance, that's also when advertising.
And just to get into the weeds of it, we don't need to go into too much detail, but how do you study the efficacy of election ads?
Well, it used to be easier because most election advertising in the U.S. was on broadcast television. And so 2008, for instance, I'm guessing 90% of the ad spending was on broadcast television. And so we have access to data from commercial companies who track that broadcast advertising. So we can match that up with survey data from individuals who live in those media markets. We can include questions on those surveys about how much TV they're exposed to and get a pretty good measure of what messages and the intensity of the messages that people were exposed to from each of those candidates, and then match it up with their survey data and they voted for or their evaluations of the candidates. And so that was really useful for some time. Nowadays, the media environment is so fragmented. Right? Broadcast is maybe around 50%, but there's also local cable. Streaming and connected TV are maybe up to 15, 20%. And then there's the digital and social media advertising. And we just don't have comparable exposure measures like we did for broadcast television. And so there's really no easy way to do it nowadays.
So maybe that's really interesting. And presumably there is, I mean, well, we know there is, you can do pre-testing and sort of see if people's, response to ads changed after, like response to issues changed after seeing ads, or response to candidates changed after seeing ads. But there really is no, there is no better way than actual knowing for sure what they have seen and then how they voted. And so we can't do that anymore. That's really interesting. And I guess, even if you're looking at total media spend, you still, and you can go, let's, you look at a particular state. So you look at Georgia, let's say, and you go, well, we know they've spent this much money on TV, this much money on Meta, this much on YouTube. You still can't be sure whether individual voters have seen it, because even if they're saying, yeah, I use social media 3 hours a day, there's no way of guaranteeing that they would have seen those ads, whether you could have been much more sure of it with broadcast TV.
That's right. And even someone who's living in a very competitive battleground state like Georgia, that person may be exposed to tons and tons and tons of advertising, but another person whose media mix is different may have been exposed to very little. We can also, do some like county level models, but getting data on like digital spending, we can get that at the state level, but not at the county level. And so it's just really, really difficult to nail that down definitively these days.
There's a sort of adage that gets shared around, which is that election advertising only really matters at the margins. If it's a super tight race, it might get you 1 or 2% or something like that. If you have a slight advantage in terms of either creative or media exposure, do you subscribe to that?
I think that's mostly true, but I can also think of some examples where advertising could really have a much bigger impact. Give me $1 billion in a primary race, even for president, that can matter. It can make people who've never heard of you before know who you are and what you stand for. Now, the real world examples of this, Michael Bloomberg didn't win a Democratic nomination, but it, I'm certain, got him more than a percentage point or two by spending all that money, right?
Yeah.
Now, give me $100,000 for a city council race, that money's really going to matter, right? Because not that many voters there. We probably don't know too much about those candidates. And so that's where the money can really matter a lot.
Let's dwell on the Bloomberg candidacy for a moment, because so for listeners' sort of memories, it was 2020. There was a Democrat primary for president. The race was wide open, huge number of candidates, and Michael Bloomberg enters the race and spends millions and millions and millions of dollars and falls short. I think he only wins. Does he win one primary race, which was a very small one on an island somewhere or something like that? And so lots of people sort of laughed and said, you can spend all that money, but you can't, it doesn't mean you can win a single state. But I think the truth of the lesson is he entered the race super late, and had almost nothing going for him except for his amazing advertising muscle. And he came, he won decent shares of the vote in some very competitive states.
That's right. And if Michael Bloomberg had something else to offer other than a boring persona, then maybe he would have had more success too.
It goes to show, if you have enough money, you really can even. And so Trump was outspent in election advertising in 2016, 2020, and 24. Yeah, he won twice, very nearly won in 2020. In almost any other year, he'd have won in 2020 because he got a crazy high number of people voting for him. So some people would go, okay, so this guy, he's been outspent 3 times. Maybe election advertising is getting less effective because with someone like Trump, he's sort of hacked the earned media machine, and compared to that, spending a load of money on election advertising, it's just pales in insignificance. Is there? I guess there's 2 things in that. Let's start with: is there any evidence that election advertising in general is getting less effective?
There is some evidence. I can't remember the authors of the paper, but they've shown that maybe the effectiveness of, say, a 1,000 spot ad advantage in a Senate race has declined over time. It's still effective, it's still positive, but it's smaller than it was maybe 10 or 20 years ago. I think the other thing, yes, Trump was outspent on advertising in 2024, but it was really close on broadcast television. All those battleground states, it was almost even. Harris and Trump ads canceling each other out. Trump was outspent on digital and social media in 2024, but a lot of that Harris advertising was advertising to Californians to please send some money my way.
Right.
It wasn't designed to persuade. And so I describe 2024 as a fairly evenly balanced playing field.
That's interesting. And is there any evidence of when you have for sure, earned media is worth. Well, this is an interesting question. Am I right in saying that earned media is worth a hell of a lot more than paid media?
Yes, because any effect you have isn't going to cost you anything, right? And so I think there's some good studies of the 2016 presidential primary on the Republican side and just how much more earned media that Donald Trump got compared to the other candidates. And he really was able to spin that into the party's nomination.
And so and advertising can be very useful in creating earned media, right? So if you do an ad that's controversial enough or interesting enough or has a certain character in it or whatever it might be, the media are gonna write about it. Why is advertising or election advertising so well positioned to generate earned media?
I think part of it is a lot of reporters nowadays are on a 24-hour news cycle where they have to crank out content constantly, and the release of a new political ad is news, right? That's a story I can write quickly. It contains conflict because one candidate is attacking another candidate. There may be some visuals to go along with that. 30 seconds, 15 seconds. And so it makes for a quick and easy news story that has conflict, which is the sort of thing that draws eyeballs. And of course, we're metrics driven now in the news media, and that's what we want. We want eyeballs. So there's a bit of media logic there that I think explains why the advertising can get so much earned media as well.
Yeah, totally. Okay, let's go on to should I advertise early or should I advertise late? So in the in the UK, and I think this happens in every presidential cycle as well. Um, the There's usually quite a big splurge on advertising towards the start of the contest, particularly if you're the incumbent president and your challenger wins the nomination race. Usually, that's a great time to spend a hell of a lot of money on sort of defining your opponent, and you spoke earlier about the first ads that you see for a candidate are often particularly effective, um, and yet there is it seems evidence that ad impact decays very quickly. See, some people say, I think maybe this was in your research, it can be around 5 days an advertising effect can last for. How do you reconcile those two things, that it's important to spend early because that's in some ways when they're most effective, but you're potentially months out from polling day?
Yeah, so I think it's for different purposes. You advertise early. One, again, is to just, yeah, as you said, to define that opponent, to start to create those connections in people's minds about what this person is about. And so if it's Mitt Romney in 2012, rich oligarch, whatever, doesn't care about common people, Bain Capital, fired people from their jobs. Um, okay, so that, rests somewhere in people's minds, but also it makes the news media say, oh, we better investigate this Bain Capital thing. And did he actually fire people? And is he a heartless corporate raider? And then there's some news stories about that, right? And so it can also maybe shape the way in which the news media cover that election as well. That takes away space that could have been um, discussing Mitt Romney's plans to improve the country, right? And so that's important, but you also want to get people right before they go into the voting booth with your final message. And when do people go to the voting booth in the US? Well, it's over the course of at least 30 days now.
Yeah, we found out during the Harris campaign that, as soon as she's won, ballots are open, basically.
Yes, yes. And many people don't even go to the voting booth because they get their ballot in the mail and they put it in the mail. And so you have to be doing that final message for 30 days, which is a big change from the past as well.
One more campaigning rule of thumb that I wanted to sort of run past you, as well as the sort of, do you go early or do you go late? I've seen an argument, and I think it was in your book, that there's an argument for running positive ads when you're ahead in the polls, and negative ads when you're behind. Could you explain the logic of that?
Yeah, the logic of that is when you're behind, you have to shake up the race somehow. You have to get some people to start thinking differently. Um, and the most effective way to do that is through negative advertising. What is that contrast? What is the reason to vote for me as opposed to my opponent? If I'm ahead, I just want to make sure people maintain that enthusiasm, that they actually do vote. And so I can run those positive ads with the rah-rah messages and coast to election day. Or at least that is the thinking.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And actually, these rules of thumb are so helpful to have in campaigns, aren't they? And I like the idea of, well, in the UK, or he's an Australian. There's a guy called Linton Crosby, but I like the idea of these consultants in the States who've just got a Bible of all these campaign rules of thumb that they can rattle through every time they're on a campaign. So you've touched on it a bit already, but let's talk about this shifting landscape where more and more of election ad spending is going from TV to digital and social media. Is there any fundamental differences in how voters perceive that advertising? Do voters perceive online social media advertising differently to, say, TV or radio?
I think they do. I think part of it is just the way we interact with social media. It tends to be rather quick. We swipe. And so candidates try to kind of forward the message in those digital ads. So maybe I'll get the message in the first 3 or 4 seconds before I leave it. Whereas on TV, people are still used to watching the 30-second ad. I know some change the channel, but we're kind of used to that. That's kind of expected. My program won't continue until these ads are over. Another big difference is just the goals that campaigns have with their digital ads. A lot of that in the US is fundraising. It's not designed to persuade. And in fact, there's really not a body of evidence yet that suggests that online ads even persuade.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so I think, and it seems that digital and social are reaching their pinnacle, maybe already have, and campaigns are putting much more money into streaming and connected TV. Those streaming ads are great. Um, you know, it, they're audio visual, so they can appeal to the emotions. You have to watch this before you can get back to watching the program that you really want to watch, right? And so people are paying attention. They're not going to abandon the ad in the middle because they really want to watch Love Island or whatever it is these days. And so we see a lot more money going into streaming and CTV, money that maybe in the past would have gone to Meta or Google.
So you get all the benefits of TV in terms of immersion and people can't skip it. But you also get all the benefits of um, data and targeting and things like that.
Absolutely, yes.
Um, and and in thinking about in the UK or in probably in Europe too, like the connected TV um, landscape, because lots of the big players like Amazon Prime and I think even Netflix now uh, don't don't take political ads. Getting the scale is really hard. Is that the case in the US? Like, how easy is it if you wanted to? Everyone's on Meta or TikTok or YouTube or whatever, so you can scale social media so easily. Can you get the scale on connected TV?
Increasingly you can, though, as you mentioned, some of the biggest players are not yet accepting political ads, but there are plenty of companies out there that are, finding blocks on various devices, various platforms in which you can get your ads seen. Now, some of that is kind of premium audiences. Some of it maybe less than premium audiences. And so advertisers still worry about that. But there is more inventory now than there has been in the past. And I think campaigns would love to see even more inventory. So if they could talk, Disney into running political ads or Netflix into running political ads, that could be a big market.
Yeah. And the incentives are there, right? I mean, it's like, how much was spent on the last, you may not have this number at your fingertips, but how much was spent in the 24 cycle?
Um, on political advertising as a total, I think it was around $11 billion across all campaigns in the US.
Okay. So an increasingly competitive connected TV landscape. Surely some of these big players will come online. I hope so. And you've, I think, found that there is some difference in election ad perception in different generations. Is that right? So older people see election advertising maybe more negatively?
That is the case. Yes, we've found some age differences there.
And so,
Um,
and so, does that mean that the advertising with younger people is more effective?
More effective. That's hard to say. Um, You might infer that, just that younger people are more open to advertising or political advertising. Older people grew up at a time when they were watching TV and these political ads came on, and it was frustrating because you just wanted to watch your program and you couldn't avoid them. Right. And so I think that left a negative taste in their mouth, whereas younger people grew up in a time when, yes, there were political ads, but um, I could scroll past them quickly or swipe, or it was just in the background like any other ad. And so they may not have such a negative connotation. Now, maybe that's changing as there's more forced viewing of these through streaming and through CTV. Um, but that's, we did have one study that found.
Okay, and final question. So in 2026, probably, towards the halfway point, maybe towards the end of the year, we're going to start to see primary candidates for president start to announce themselves. And, 28 is going to be a humdinger of a year because we'll have two open seat contests. So you will be a busy man in 2028. If you were to give advice to some of those candidates, thinking about running for presidential nomination for the first time, uh, what advice would you, if you had to give them one piece of advice on their election advertising, what would you say to them?
Boy, help me give one piece of advice, huh? Um, I think just being multimodal, not just putting all of your eggs into one basket or one type of advertising, but really trying to connect with different audiences in different ways through different mediums, and not being afraid to do that. But this is really a second piece of advice that I'm
Yeah,
attaching on to the first one.
I'll allow
Um,
it.
yeah, but to make sure that there is also some message consistency across those. So I think, the best campaign might be one with a central message that carries through everything, but there's also individualized messages attached onto that, depending upon the medium and depending on the targeted audience. Um, I don't know if just speaking about one small issue to one particular group and a different small issue to another group is going to win it for you. So that's my advice, but I've given bad advice in the past. So
Well, I think that sounds like excellent advice. Travis, thanks so much for your time. It's been a really fascinating conversation. As you can probably tell, I've absolutely loved it. So thanks so much for coming on.
yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure to chat.